I don't know if you're aware, you probably are. There are books about Jesus that were written, like Gospels, of his life, that didn't make it into the Bible. They're non-canonical. That's what they call it. That's just fancy talk. There are books from Jesus' life, Thomas wrote one, different people. One of those non-canonical books tells the story of Jesus' resurrection. Afterwards, the disciples were afraid that the government was coming for them, and they were right. And so they went and hid. They locked the doors. They're inside. And then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up in the room. And they're all astonished and amazed. And someone says, "Oh, he's risen." And they all go silent. Not a word. And then Thomas goes over to him and inspects his hands and his side and says, "He's risen indeed." And that is where that tradition comes from. That's not true. I made that up. It's not. He is risen indeed. That tradition, it turns, not even Google knows where that started. They don't know. The church started saying it. It's just a thing. But I know some of you really like it. And for that reason, I'm going to do you a solid. He is risen. All right. Not as many of you were into that as I thought maybe, but that's okay. That's okay. I'm going to read to you from actually all of John chapter 20. Subtitle, now this is canonical gospel. This is in the Bible. Subtitle for this chapter is The Resurrection. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciples and the one whom Jesus loved. And she said, "They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noted the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scripture that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Mary was standing outside of the tomb, crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been laying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they've taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they've put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you put him, and I'll go get him." "Mary," Jesus said, and she turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father, but go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave him his message. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. They were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. And again he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." And then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. And if you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, was not with them, with the others when Jesus came. And they told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side." 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. And then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. May God bless the reading and study of his word today. Oh, it's a good day. Death, where is your sting? That is the phrase that the psalmist wrote long before Jesus came. It's part of the prophecy that spoke of Jesus' coming victory. Death, where is your sting? I love that question because it is aggressive, it has attitude, and it puts the enemy in his place. Death, where's your sting? When someone dies for a cause, we often say that they have paid the ultimate price because there's nothing higher. There's no greater cost. It is the thing that mankind has feared since the very beginning. It's the greatest weapon and the greatest threat that evil has. Death. Jesus walks out of the tomb and the enemy is defeated. His greatest weapon has no effect on the great I am. Death, where is your sting? That fact gives us new life. And it gives us confidence. Confidence like Esther had. Remember what she said? Esther, now this is in the Old Testament. She's speaking about this situation where she may be put to death. And she says in 4:16 of her book, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I'm going to go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. There is a confidence there. And she said it before Easter. She said it before Christmas. Because resurrection is not a one-time only move for our God. Let me read to you from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son. A large crowd from the village was with her. The Lord saw her, and his heart overflowed with compassion. Don't cry, he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. Young man, he said, I tell you, get up. Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Let me read you again from Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 35. Chapter 5, starting in verse 35. Well, he was still speaking to her. Messengers arrived. Jesus is talking to this woman. Then messengers come up, this guy from the home of Jairus and the leader of the synagogue, and they told him, your daughter is dead. Don't bother Jesus anymore. But Jesus overheard them and said to Jesus, don't be afraid, just have faith. Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except for Peter, James, and John. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw how much commotion and weeping and wailing was going on. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep. The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. I'm not done. John chapter 11, a man named Lazarus was sick. Let's jump down. We know most of the story. Jump to verse 30 where it says, Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, so they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him. He was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked him. They told him, Lord, come and see. Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby, see how much he loved him, they said. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus was still a little angry. As he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Does that sound familiar? He said, roll the stone aside. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. And then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for your hearing me. You always hear me. I said out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so they'll believe you sent me. And Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave's clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told him, unwrap him and let him go. And it's not just Jesus that does this resurrection work. Let's keep going. How about Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 52. Nice and easy. This is during Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus shouted again. He's on the cross, and he released his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. Let's go Old Testament. You want to go Old Testament? 2 Kings, chapter 13, verses 20 and 21. Then Elisha died and was buried. Groups of Moabite raiders used to invade the land each spring. Once, when some Israelites were burying a man, they spied a man of these raiders. So they hastily threw the corpse into the tomb of Elisha and fled. But as soon as the body touched Elisha's bones, the dead man revived and jumped to his feet. And there's more in the Old Testament. How about 1 Kings? 1 Kings chapter 17. 17 through 22. Too many verses there sticking together. Here we go, 17 through 22. Sometime later, this woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. So she says to Elijah, "Oh, man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" But Elijah said, "Give me your son." He took the child's bodies from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid the body on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?" He stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, please let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. There's more. There's more. There's more. I could read about the Shunammite son. Let's look at the New Testament. Let's go back here. Here's something that Peter did in Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 40. There was a believer in Joppa named Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas, so we're going to call her Tabitha for her sake. She was also doing good things for others and helping the poor. About this time she became ill and died. Her body was washed for burial and laid in an upstairs room, but the believers had heard that Peter was nearby. So they sent 2 men to beg him, "Please come as soon as possible." So Peter returned to them, and as soon as he arrived, they took him up to the stairs to the room. The room was filled with widows who were weeping and showing him the coats and other clothes that Dorcas had made for them. But Peter asked them all to leave the room. Then he knelt and prayed. Turning to the body, he said, "Get up, Tabitha." And she opened her eyes. When she saw Peter, she sat up. Let's look at one more. Here's the Apostle Paul, and also in Acts chapter 20, verses 10 and 12. Paul went down, bent over him, over this dead body, and took him in his arms. "Don't worry," he said. "He's alive." He's alive. The story, Paul's preaching. This kid gets tired. He falls out the window 3 stories to his death. They keep having church. Paul goes down and says, "Don't worry, he's alive." And then the kid goes home and he's fine. We call death the ultimate price. The reason is it's because we can only pay it once. It's the ultimate price. But there is a God who has the riches to pay that price again and again and again, so much so that he does it for you when you don't need it, when you don't want it, when you don't deserve it. He does it. He pays the price for you again and again and again. Now let's look back at the empty tomb. It's this small, dark, cold place. And when the stone's in place, it's inescapable. In fact, when the stone's in place, it's hopeless. But on Easter morning, the stone is gone. On Easter morning, there is light inside, but there is no corpse. What we find are these bedcloths, these strips of cloth that had been wrapped tightly around Jesus' crucified body, and now they laid empty. But that's not it. the head covering. Remember, when Lazarus came out of the tomb, he still had the head covering on him, right? But Jesus is gone. There's the head covering, not in a heap, but neatly folded. Don't miss that Jesus is making a statement right there. It is a testimony that he had indeed been there. He had indeed been dead, but he is risen indeed. When death is defeated, things are out of whack. Do you understand that? The laws of this life are broken, and people look for an answer every time. They will always find one somehow, somewhere, some way they can reconcile what they've seen. And so Jesus says, let's make this real clear. I'm going to fold this here, and that's going to increase their curiosity. And then he shows up again and again before people to tell them that God is the one that resurrected them. When you are set free from bondage, when you are healed of sickness, when you are given new life where you had been dead or dying, you are to let people know. See, God has been raising the dead for thousands of years. Jesus did it. Jesus was raised himself. Peter and Paul did it. And we've heard this morning that God didn't stop when he finished writing his book. He's still bringing the dead back to life. God is still in the resurrection business. Okay? And on this Resurrection Sunday, God is open for business. Young and old, male and female, innocent and guilty, God has resurrection power for them all. That's why Esther could say, if I die, I die. My death is a thing that my God can handle. Whatever thing in your life is starting to look like a tomb. If you're there because you put yourself there, or if you're there by no fault of your own, if it's medical or financial or relational or spiritual, God is in the resurrection business. And business is open for you today. God has resurrection power for you. I don't know which, you hear me, the mic's on. God has resurrection power for you. The stone can be rolled away, and you can crawl out of that tomb. The door's right here. The band's going to play. It's Resurrection Sunday. Don't die. Don't keep dying. Come find life.